Hello and welcome to College Algebra. Today we are discussing Chapter 1.5 out of the Coburn College Algebra book, and it is called Solving Quadratic Equations. This should be a review from your intermediate algebra class, and so we're going to go pretty quickly through some examples. We are going to do some of the exercises from the book starting on page 125. So first what we want to talk about is the zero product property. And the zero product property is essential to solving quadratic equations. And in fact, it's going to be essential to solving other types of equations. So, zero product property. So first of all, to have a product that equals 0, this is the property that says if A times B equals 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. And the key thing here is that we are multiplying right there. And so to write something as multiplication means that we are going to factor it. So let's first look at example 18. So 18 says z squared minus 10z equals negative 21. And so first of all, for zero product property, it has to be equal to 0. So your very first step would be adding 21 to both sides, in which z squared minus 10z plus 21 equals 0. So once it is equal to 0, you're going to factor it, because there's the product part. So however you factor, whether you do trial and error or what we call the AC method, this one I'm just going to use some trial and error. It's negative 3 and negative 7. That multiplies to be a positive 21, adds to be a negative 10. And so this then says that you just set both of those factors equal to 0, and you're going to solve both of them, and you're going to get two answers in this case, z equals 3 and z equals 7. So that's the zero product property. Let's go ahead and look at number 30. 30 says n cubed minus 3n squared minus 4n plus 12 equals 0. So not exactly in that trinomial form that we are used to, but if you remember, whenever you have four terms, you want to factor by grouping. And so from the first two, we can pull out an n squared, leaving an n minus 3. And from the second two, I want to pull out actually a negative 4 so that I also get an n minus 3 because we pulled out that negative. And then if I pull out that greatest common factor of n minus 3, then I have n squared minus 4. And you always want to make sure that something is completely factored. And so if you look at that n squared minus 4, it is a difference of squares, which means that it's going to factor again. And so in this case, you're going to end up with three factors that you're going to set all three of them equal to 0. And in this case, you're going to have three answers, n equals 3, 2, and negative 2. There's our three answers. Alright, I do want to look at one other example of zero product property, and that would be number 36. And so just to refresh our memories, what do we do when it's not equal to 0 but it's already factored? So we get g plus 17 times g minus 2, and it equals 20. So you cannot make it g plus 17 equals 20 and g minus 2 equals 20, because that's not how the zero product property works. And so unfortunately, you are going to have to FOIL this out, because we have to move the 20 over, and there's no place to put the 20 at the moment since it's already factored. So g squared minus 2g, plus 17g minus 34 equals 20, and now I can move the 20 over. Okay, so we're going to get g squared. We'll go ahead and make this be plus 15g minus 54 equals 0. So now what you're going to want to do is refactor this. And so 9 and 6. Nope, that's not going to work. Let's see. Alright, so what about 3 and 18? If we do a negative 3, positive 18. So we set both factors equal to 0. And our answers then are 3 and negative 18. So the next thing we want to look at briefly is what's called the square root property. And so it's taking a step back real quick. When do you want to do, let's say in this case, zero product property, or when do I want to do square root property? So you're only going to use square root property when you can factor, and so not everything is factorable, so you can't always use square root property, but it should be your first go-to because factoring should be fairly easy for you. Square root property you can only use in the form a squared or x squared equals a, so that you have the x squared but there is no x term. Okay, you square root both sides, and then x equals plus or minus the square root of a. Do keep in mind that we're looking for as many answers as our highest exponent, and we will talk about that a little more in detail later on in the semester. But that is where this plus or minus needs to come from, is that I am looking for two answers. Or the fact, if you have x squared equals 9 and we square root both sides, x equals plus or minus 3 because 3 squared is 9 and negative 3 squared is 9. So if we look at some examples on square root property, we're going to start with just 42, and 42 says p squared equals 49. And so what are we going to do to get p by itself? We're going to square root both sides, and then p equals plus or minus 7, and you're done. Okay, so that's the problem. So what happens if it's not already in that form? So if we look at 44, you get m squared minus 20 equals 0. And so it has to be the something squared equals the other thing. So you have to add 20 to the other side. And m squared equals 20. And then we're going to square root both sides. And we're going to add our plus or minus equals plus or minus. Let's try that one more time. And then we're going to break down the square root of 20. It breaks down in the square root of 4, square root of 5. So this is 2 square root of 5. Remember, you always simplify your radicals. All right, so what happens though if, sometimes you get a negative on the other side? So let's look at that real quick. N squared plus 5 equals 0. Okay, so we have to move the 5 over. Don't square root yet. You can't square root a sum and difference. It does nothing for you. You can't take it anywhere. So you want to get n squared by itself first. So now when I square root, I get a negative under the square root. We can go ahead and write it. It is plus or minus I squared of 5. In the case of the directions here at the moment, though, it does say if there is no real solution, state so. So since that is not real, since it has an I in there, we're just going to write no real solution. But that is what you would write otherwise if it didn't state that in the directions. Okay, I want to look at one more real quick. Let's look at number 52. 52 is m minus 4 squared equals 5. And you do not want to FOIL the left-hand side out. Your goal is to get to the m, and to get to the m, you have to get rid of that square, and so you're going to just start by square rooting. You get m minus 4 equals, and we're going to add plus or minus the square root of 5. Next step is you're going to move the 4 over, and I want you to write that 4 out front. You should always write your radical at the end, just in case somebody's going to assume that whatever becomes after the radical is also under it. So you get 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. So there is going over square root property. So let's look at our next property. Next property is completing the square. Okay, and hopefully you have some directions on completing the square. Here's just some basic directions. First of all, we'll start with an example. Let's do number 68. So we're going to look at x squared minus 8x minus 1 equals 0. And so the purpose behind completing the square is you want to make a perfect square trinomial. Because when you have a perfect square trinomial, so x squared, let me actually use, I think the book does a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. When you factor this, you get 1 binomial squared. And so then if I have that, what I can do is I can really use the square root property and just square root that to get rid of the squared. And so in this case, it would not be equal to 0 like the zero product property is. So you want to make a perfect square trinomial. At the moment, this is not a perfect square trinomial. So step number 1 is to move C to the other side. Can't write and talk today. Let's see here. Move C. Okay, and if you remember, a general form for a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c. So that's where we're getting c from. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. So x squared minus 8x, and I want to leave a space and make it equal to 1. Okay. Also, real quick, I just want to mention you can only complete the square with a leading coefficient of 1. And so, going through the list again, you can only use zero product property if it factors. You can only use square root property if you just have an x squared and not an x. And so you can only do completing the square if the leading coefficient's 1. Now, if the leading coefficient's not 1, all you have to do is divide by it to make it 1, divide everything by it. That can produce some undesirable fractions, but you can still do it. Alright, so step number 2 though here. We are going to take half of b, square it, and then add to both sides. And this is the completing the square step. This is making a perfect square trinomial. So b is 8, or negative 8, okay? When you square it, it turns positive, so you don't have to note the negative if you don't want to. So half of that is 4. 4 squared is 16. So we are adding 16 to both sides. So what you have made is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so that was our goal. So our next step is that we are going to factor the left-hand side. Abbreviation there for left-hand side. And so this is going to factor into x minus 4 squared. And we're going to go ahead at the same time simplify the right-hand side. And then we're going to finish with the square root property. So step number 4 is just to finish the problem with the square root property. So we're going to go ahead and square root both sides and get x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. And then in this case, since the square root of 17 does not break down, add 4 to both sides, and we get 4 plus or minus the square root of 17. And that then is completing the square. Okay, so we're going to just look at one more example of completing the square, and I'm going to go back to number 64. And it is m squared plus 8m, and I'm going to go ahead and leave a space, and it equals negative 12. And so the first step's already done for you. C has already been moved to the other side, so don't move it back because you're just going to have to move it back to the other side. So we're going to start with step 2. We're going to take half of b and add it to both, square it and add it to both sides. So half of b is 4. 4 squared is 16, so we are adding 16 to both sides. Okay, the next step is we're going to factor, and so this factors into m plus 4 squared equals 4. And then when we square root both sides to finish with our square root property, we're going to get m plus 4 equals plus or minus 2. Okay, subtract 4, and that looks like m equals negative 4 plus or minus 2. And if you can actually do the math, we need to do it. So negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. Negative 4 minus 2 is negative 6. And there's our answers. And so the last thing we want to look at is the quadratic formula. Okay, so one more time. Zero product property works only if you can factor it. Square root property works only if there's just an x squared. Completing the square really works best if there's a leading coefficient of 1. And if not, completing the square should always work, but it can be really troublesome with some of the fractions you might get. And so we end up with the quadratic formula, and the quadratic formula works all the time. The quadratic formula will always work. And if you remember, the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And again, those are taken from standard form. That's where you get your a, b, and c from. So make sure your quadratics are written in descending order. All right, and we are going to look at number 102. So 102 says 4m squared equals 12m minus 15. And actually, I don't want to look at 102. I've assigned you 102. Let me look at my note here. My note says to look at number 100, so sorry about that. Let's look at number 100. 2p squared minus 4p plus 11 equals 0. Okay. So a little hint on 102, when you go to do it, the very first thing you want to do is make it equal to 0. So move everything. I would move everything to the left-hand side, but in this case it doesn't matter what your leading coefficient is. So you could move it to the right-hand side as well. All right, so here is my A, here is my B, here is my C. Signs do matter. So we're going to get x equals negative b, which is going to be a positive 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times 11 all over 2 times 2. And you're just going to simplify. So 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 88 all over 4. And I didn't bring a calculator in to do the recording with me, so let's see here. It might take me a second. Minus 6 is 82, so it would be negative 72. And we're going to split that apart. That is going to be the square root of 9, square root of 8. Also, the square root of negative 1 is in there. So we get 4 plus or minus 3i square root of 8 all over 4. And I would say you're going to leave your answer like that. If you wanted to split it apart, you could, and it would be 1 plus or minus 3i squared of 8 over 4. But I really like the one complete answer there. If you want to break it apart, though, either one is fine. All right, so there's a review on the 4 ways to solve a quadratic equation. If you have any questions, let me know. You do have some word problems also, and we will go over those in class next time. Have a good day.